So let me run through 4 provocative propositions for, I think, everybody in this room. And apparently I've got to rush because the clock is going faster than I thought. So, number 1, and I really urge you to embrace this, we are not neutral in this struggle. There is no Switzerland in this struggle. On the table right now, be it because of politics and the way we're doing politics at the moment, or because of technology and changes in society, you can pick your culprit. But as a result, core values are currently on the table in American society. Things like decency, the value of democracy, respect for each other, identification of another person's humanity, equity, the belief that everybody is entitled to a seat at the table, the notion of community itself. The people we purport to serve, and this is particularly for the foundations in the room, the people we purport to serve are vulnerable and at risk as never before, because their value is being questioned. As a friend of mine, the social critic Rich Benjamin, said at a conference we held recently, there is no such thing as an innocent bystander right now. So if we take nothing else away from this conversation, provocative proposition number 1 is we can't be neutral. So what does that make us? The second proposition I put to you is that supporting journalism, media, the integrity of democratic systems, the Knight package, if you will, is the moral leadership issue of our times for our field. There's a great quote from Friedrich Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil that I've recently come across, and I love to use this because it speaks to the situation. It goes like this: I did that, says my memory. I could not have done that, says my pride, and remains inexorable. Eventually, memory yields. We are in a moment of national forgetting in our country. We are forgetting what memory tells us. Memory tells us that we have committed grievous harms against people based on race, against people based on ethnicity, against people based on being somehow differentiated from the majority. And we have to atone for that. We are forgetting that we pay a price for hateful rhetoric, that poisoning our air and our water comes with consequences for us and for our children and our grandchildren, that we lose every time we ignore science, that we suffer when we ignore each other's pain. Memory teaches us that we pay the ultimate price for disunity and contempt. Pride is telling us none of that matters. Only my group matters, and only this moment matters. So we have to lean in on the side of memory, on remembering what we know as human beings who have grown through time. We have to lean in on the side of memory, and by doing that, make foundations be agents of reform, not just of privilege. Journalism and media and engaging in democracy are practical, pragmatic ways of doing that. And if I have time, I'll come back to that one. Or maybe we can talk about it. The third proposition I'd put to you is that this is not partisan. It's not partisan. I've heard people say that during a speech by a journalist, that they really loved the speech until the part where he got political. Oh, what was that part, I asked? Well, it was the part where he mentioned the First Amendment. It's in the Constitution, but it's now suddenly political. It is not political to count everybody in the country. And yet, the notion is being hotly debated that any support for the U.S. Census. It's crazy because what you're essentially saying is that to fight for everybody to be counted, for everybody to count, is a political belief rather than a math problem or a moral issue. Oh, I know what I wanted to say. So I get worked up over that one, sorry. Not only is this not partisan, it's critical to every issue that foundations engage with, and that I think many people in this room engage with. It is unlikely that America's foundation community is going to suddenly decide that funding media per se is the thing that it wants to do. But there are hundreds of foundations that are beginning to understand across the country that the practical way in is through the issues they care about. We fund environmental journalism because we care about quality environmental coverage. We, in our case, and the Hillman Foundation's case, my colleagues from Pittsburgh, fund other organizations that are more general in nature. But if we recognize that this issue isn't partisan, we can begin to look at the ways in which it advances our work. And it doesn't advance the work. And in fact, if you think about what foundations are trying to accomplish, or any of us in this room, in trying to inform and change society, you can't do it in the context of a society that is being lied to about every issue. You can't change people's minds in the absence of good information about climate or about toxins in the air and the water and so on. Actually, I think it's important to note in the context of this that there is a criticism right now about our field, that we are too much creatures of capitalism, that the wealth that we came from confines us in our ability to work to change society. What's not talked about enough in criticism of philanthropy is whether we're fiercely enough defenders of the democracy that we also come from. There really isn't actually a great example in the world of a thriving civic sector in an oppressive or non-democratic regime. And the antidote to the concerns about philanthropy being not just creatures of privilege, but being advocates of reform, is to fight harder, is to worry less about the capitalism part and fight harder for the democracy part. Finally, the fourth proposition that I'd share is that community is where we must and can do this work. I just want to share this Pittsburgh story in the wake of the two shootings that I mentioned, Antoine Rose Jr. and the Tree of Life. Here's what happened at a high level following Antoine's death. There was an initial bad news report that appeared to immediately suggest he was at fault, suggesting that there were guns in the car, that he was a bad kid. Turns out he was an honor student. But there was an initial bad report about it. But then the truth began to filter out in the community about him and about what had happened. And suddenly, the First Amendment began to happen in Pittsburgh. We had a journalist report that got it wrong, and then other journalism that happened that got it right. And protests in the street, not about the stories, but about what had happened to Antoine. And then a community coming together to have a conversation about police violence in our community and the violence that was experienced against black men. Similar thing happened in the Tree of Life case, except that it started off with beautiful reporting. Some of the best writing I've ever seen on a deep emotional level that told the truth of the community that I happen to live in was done in the immediate aftermath of the Tree of Life massacre. Beautiful writing about what the community looks like and how it functions. There were assemblies, as guaranteed in the First Amendment, of people mourning and protesting and trying to express their grief. And then that turned into protests when the president came to town, because some people felt that his rhetoric was partly responsible for what had happened. And that, of course, turned into counter-protests over whether that was a fair criticism. The community, though, overall displayed a capacity to solve its challenge by coming together and have that debate. And they did it on the streets, and they did it in libraries, and they did it in meeting rooms. But they did it. And then, interestingly, immediately after that, there was a backlash from some members of the African American community who pointed out that there was a disparate reaction between what happened in the case of Tree of Life and what happens typically in the aftermath of killings of members of the African American population. And what they were pointing out was that the community's willingness to come together in a robust way seemed more full to them than it did in the cases of their loss. And you could probably dismiss that argument or embrace that argument, but instead what the community did was begin to reach out across those divides. Organizations of civil society like the Jewish Community Center for Loving Kindness, which was created to bridge divides in the community, began actually to reach out to leaders in the African American community, and together they figured out how to have a conversation among the whole community on this issue. And I share that example because the First Amendment, the whole process of what we're talking about in terms of the ability to use speech and just to freely express what you believe, to gather, to assemble, and to use journalism as a tool for all of this, is so often just depicted as a right, the first in the Bill of Rights. But it's also a roadmap. It's a roadmap for how democracy happens. And if we're going to save what we see at risk now, the only way to do that is by resorting to that and following that roadmap. I would just close with this. I'm sorry for being over time, but I'd close with this. A couple of nights after the Tree of Life massacre, I did a lot of wandering on the streets that week, and I went up to the makeshift memorial that was situated outside the synagogue. And I read a sign that kind of inspired me. It was in the shape of a dove, and it said, "Strangers together." And I thought, isn't that a beautiful thought? And then I went and sat at Starbucks and had some tea and looked at the photo I had taken of that sign and realized it didn't say "strangers together." It said "stronger together." And I thought, well, I don't like that as much. So I did what good writers do. I put them together. What struck me as beautiful in that is we are, in fact, strangers together. That's the whole human enterprise. It's the whole community building that we do, that everybody in this room, regardless of where you are on the spectrum of beliefs, I think you're in this room because you care about that. We come into this world alone, and we operate so much alone, and we care about our own lives, and yet we're thrown into proximity with others. And what we discover is that the way we transform that into a beautiful experience is by being together, by being stronger together. And I just love the synergy of that. I think it is the work that is represented by that whole night package. Thank you for being a part of it.